Hello everybody, welcome back to the Fish Room. Today's video is going to be about yesterday's meeting in the Chicago Livebearer Society. We had Dr. John Lyons come in. He's actually the namesake for Teuchitlan Lyonsi, which isn't these guys. These are just some, these are my Cracodon audax altaboso and some guppy dithers. But wanted to share the presentation that Dr. John Lyons gave. It was pretty incredible. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you guys do as well. I liked it so much that I got his autograph after the presentation. Also, I was super pumped about this. I got my Breeder Award Program plaque from the Chicago Livebearer Society. Super excited. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into this presentation.
Geologically active area, and it's part of what's called the neovolcanic axis, which is a mountain range, a volcanic mountain range that originated, like I said, about 20 million years ago. And it contains at least 20 volcanoes, of which 4 or 5 are still active today. And so that's that yellow area across the central, from east to west, across the central part of Mexico. All those little reddish triangles are volcanoes, and then all of the green dots are epicenters of earthquakes. So it's a very, very active geological area. And the area we're going to focus on is in the shadow of the Teuchitlan volcano. And many of you think, well, it's named after the liquor. No, the liquor is named after the volcano, because this is the area in which it was first produced of this complex here. But this is what it looked like when people first came into this area. It just looks like a hill. All these temples and everything that have been excavated and restored just look like hills with trees on them. And the local farmers, would find these rocks and use them to, build their houses and stuff. And no one really recognized the significance of this particular site until about 50 or so years ago. And this is what it looks like when they're restored. These are these really interesting circular temples. There's really nothing comparable or analogous to it in the rest of Mesoamerica. Everything else tends to be more square, triangular. And so this is a unique area with unique ruins and a unique culture, again, that thrived about 2,000 years ago and disappeared more than 1,000 years ago. You have to anticipate your need many years in advance. These blue agaves grow, they're kind of these spiky things, but what you're really interested in is the kind of the root system. And then they cut all these leaves off. The things look kind of like pineapples. They're full of a fluid. They gather those up, bring them into the processing area. They crush all of these to get the liquid off. Then they boil them and distill them, and ultimately ferment them in cases and to produce high quality tequila. And so when I was putting this together, the interesting thing is National Tequila Day. I had no idea this when I just pulled this off the internet. That's actually my birthday, July 24th. So I think that kind of explains a lot. So I was born on National Tequila Day. So maybe that I was predestined to work in this part of Mexico. Anyway, why that? That's some background on the culture and the history of the area. But from a Goodeid standpoint, from a tropical fish standpoint, okay, this is nice, but why do we care? Well, Teuchitlan is a really interesting place biologically, and what we know about Teuchitlan we owe mostly to this man, Dr. Robert Miller, who was the curator of fishes at the University of Michigan Zoological Museum in Ann Arbor, and he really is the dean of ichthyologists working in Mexico. He literally wrote the book on the freshwater fishes of Mexico, and he worked in Mexico for about almost 40 years and worked all over the country and on all sorts of species. He really encompassed the whole country and the whole fish fauna. But Teuchitlan was one of the first places he visited, and also a place he returned to, because it was a particularly interesting and particularly unusual spot. And so his first visit was in 1955, before I was born. And this is the springs, and he said it's heavily utilized for irrigation, drinking water, and washing, with much pollution by man and livestock. So 50, 60 years ago, it was hardly a pristine area. In fact, you can think it's been being used for watering livestock, for drinking, for washing, for over 2,000 years, heavily used. So it's hardly a pristine, undisturbed area. But when he was there 60 plus years ago, fishes were extraordinarily prolific, as he says. So it was full of fish, despite the pollution, despite the heavy human use. And this is what he caught in their first survey. 10 different species of fish, all native, 6 of which at the time were completely unknown to science. They were unknown species. 6 of them were Goodeids. And you can see the 3 that we're talking about, Ameca, Scyphia francese, and Zogoneticus tequila, were unknown to science when he first went there. They were three of the species that were found there. And these are the 3 species that are actually endemic to there. That means they're found nowhere else. The other 3 Goodeid species up there, Goodeid atropinus, Xenotoca melanosoma, and Zogoneticus parapachus, those are species that are found elsewhere. So they are found in other parts of Mexico, in other habitats. But these 3 species, the Ameca, Scyphia, and Zogoneticus tequila, are found only at Teuchitlan. So it's unique in that regard. And they're endemic, they're found nowhere else but this spot. So Miller, again, like I said, he wrote the book. He described at least 50, he and his students described 54 different species of fish out of a fauna of about 500. So more than 10% of the species in the country he described, or he or his students. And he described all 3 of the species that we're interested in. Ameca back in 1971. One of his students, Dolores Kingston, did Scyphia francese in 1978. And again, fun fact, her maiden name was Lyons. Again, no relation, but there's all these weird connections here. And then he and Shane Webb described Zogoneticus tequila in 1998. Now the interesting thing about tequila is he did not recognize it as a new species when he first encountered it. He collected it way back in 1955. You look at his museum collection that he preserved and you can see it there. And he had an excellent eye. He was somebody who really recognized things that were different and unique. Yet he missed this one. He did not distinguish this from Zogoneticus parapachus, which is a similar species that also occurs there. And it wasn't until work by the British aquarist Derek Lambert back in the late 80s, early 90s, he brought these fish back in his tank and he said, wait a minute, these are something different. And frankly, Miller at this time was skeptical. Who's this aquarist, telling me that, I missed this? But in fact, he came around and realized, yes, indeed, I did miss this. So aquarists not only are important for preserving this species, but for identifying it in the first place. If it had been left just to the scientists, no one would even have recognized the species, and it would have disappeared, and no one would have been the wiser. So from early on, aquarists have played an important role in understanding and conserving the species that are found in this area. Like I said, he didn't recognize this out of the gate, and it was only many years later with Derek's insistence that he re-examined his specimens and looked at photos and so forth and said, yes, indeed, this is something different. Same area, trying to replicate his methods and efforts and so forth, just see what we get. So we only got 83 individuals, so about 20% of what he got. And where he got 6 species, we only got 3. And 2 of those species, Scyphia francese and Zogoneticus tequila, are or were in fact completely extinct in nature. The only place they had been found had been at this site, and they were gone. Scyphia, as soon as it was described, basically was gone. It had disappeared by the mid-70s. Zogoneticus was thought to be extinct, and then about 15 years ago, a little tiny population was rediscovered, and then that tiny population blinked out about 10 years ago. So 2 species are completely extinct in nature, and then Xenotoca melanosoma hasn't been seen at the springs, but that is seen elsewhere, and so that hasn't disappeared completely. So basically, these 2 species only exist because aquarists have kept them alive for the last 40 or 50 years ago. The place was hardly pristine. There's habitat modifications, there's pollution, yet the fish were thriving. What really has happened here is non-native species have been introduced, some deliberately, some accidentally. Things like tilapia, carp have been brought in for food. Other things like guppies, mollies, swordtails, platies have escaped from local aquarists or been released by local aquarists. So here's a case where on the one hand aquarists have helped this fauna, on the other hand aquarists have hurt the fauna by introducing these fish. And the one that's got in there lately, that really seems to be the bane of the fish fauna there, and it's really caused problems all over Mexico, is the so-called spot-tailed fish, or Pseudocephalus, or sometimes called Alexandria bimaculatus. This one is, again, it's a potential aquarium species, but it's not typically raised, and I think the main reason it gets in here is it gets contaminated in shipments of tilapia. They're constantly moving tilapia around, moving it for aquaculture and stocking them in various places for food production, fisheries. And as they move stuff out of these hatcheries, they often move a lot of these other little species with it, and those species cause much more harm than the tilapia themselves. I mean, tilapia gets blamed for a lot of stuff, but I think the things that come with tilapia cause more of an issue. Native species have disappeared, and we're down to about only 15% of the actual individuals are native. It's 85% introduced exotic species. So they've taken over, they've had all these impacts, they really caused some problems. Tequila have been in the hobby and kept alive by aquarists for at least 30, 40 years. So how did they enter the hobby? How did people like you and me actually originally get these fish? Well, again, you can attribute much of this to Miller. So he would go down, make these collections, he'd preserve a bunch of fish for later analysis and so forth, but he also brought back live fish to his laboratory so he could study behavior and look at reproduction and look at interactions among the different species. So he actually brought Ameca splendens back in 1966, and he brought Scyphia in 1976. He brought those back into his laboratory alive. It was a lot easier to do in those days than it is now. He had some big colonies in Ann Arbor. And he worked very closely with ALA fellow, longtime fish keeper Jim Langhammer. At the time was the curator of fishes at the Belle Isle Aquarium, which is the big public aquarium for Detroit. And Detroit and Ann Arbor, of course, are pretty close to each other. So when Bob had extra fish, he'd given to Jim, and eventually in the late 70s, he closed down his lab and basically gave everything he had left to Jim. Jim kept some of the stuff at Belle Isle, but he then spread it out, gave it to various aquarists, and got these things into the hobby. And again, that's why they persisted, because ultimately the Belle Isle, he left the Belle Isle Aquarium. The Belle Isle Aquarium actually closed for a period of time in the 2000s. It was only just recently reopened, so the Belle Isle specimens were lost. It was the aquarists that he had distributed to them in the ALA and so forth who kept things alive. And so he got them to the ALA. Now, one of Bob Miller's students, Mike Smith, was doing work in Mexico in the early 80s, and he hooked up with Derek Lambert. He was going down, Derek Lambert kind of invited himself along and went with him. And again, Bob and Mike didn't really recognize Ogoneticus tequila, but Derek did. He had a good eye, he kept these fish in the aquarium, he knew they were something different. So in 1990, he was able to bring Ogoneticus tequila back to England, and then eventually got it over to the States to ALA members. And the interesting thing was Ogoneticus tequila was never kept alive in Mexico. It was kept alive in Europe, it was kept alive in the United States, but there was, after it disappeared from Teuchitlan, from the springs, there were no populations in Mexico. So in the early 2000s, Ivan Dibble, who's another English aquarist, got Zogoneticus tequila, and he repatriated them to Mexico, to the Morelia Aqualab, where they've maintained them ever since. And so not only did the aquarists keep this fish alive, but they were responsible for bringing the fish back to Mexico and allowing it to be, as we'll see, used in reestablishment efforts. None of these things are mass market, super popular with thousands of accolades. There's just a handful of really serious, hardcore fish keepers in the United States and Europe, and a few people in Mexico keeping these things alive, yet they've been responsible for keeping these species from disappearing. What's really exciting is Morelia got those fish back in 2000 and made a plan to basically try to reintroduce them to the wild, to Teuchitlan. It was a long-term plan. It's almost been about almost a 20-year process now. But there was this remnant population that became extinct about 2009, just in that little tiny springs there. But they had been maintaining them in their tanks for many years, and then they decided to do a little experiment, and they put them out in one of these semi-wild ponds in the Arboretum for the University at Morelia, just to see how they would do. And they put a variety of different Goodeids into these ponds and just said, you know, let's put a bunch out there, leave them to their own devices. These are, you know, these just have, you know, they're kind of dug ponds with rainwater. They have snakes and birds and, you know, all sorts of natural predators. There's no feeding or anything going on. And lo and behold, Zoogneticus tequila thrived. It's not the easiest species to keep in an aquarium, but it seems to do really well in these outdoor ponds. And some of the other species they put in didn't survive at all, but they had thousands of Zoogneticus tequila after a while. And they said, hey, here's a species we might be able to reintroduce. We actually have a large enough number that we could do a significant reintroduction. So they took 1,500 of these Zoogneticus tequila, and they put them in a semi-isolated spring pond within the Teuchitlan Springs complex. Now, much of the complex is natural, but one particular area is what they call a balnearium, which we would term kind of a water park. And so they've taken some of the spring areas and they've made them kind of in the swimming pool-like areas. And this particular one, it has these kind of concrete sides, but the bottom is a natural bottom. And it's connected to the springs, but with a limited number of connections, so it's sort of pipes that go through. It's not a wide open system. And so it's an area you can kind of maintain. And so what they did there before reintroducing them is spent a lot of time trying to reduce the invasive non-native species, particularly the spot-tailed killifish, as much as possible, because that really is the reason why these fish have disappeared in the first place. You have to eliminate these non-native fishes, which both compete with them and prey on them. And then they put in the 1,500 or so Zoogneticus tequila. And this was done back in 2016, and they're very big in symbolism in Mexico, so they reintroduced these fish on the Mexican Day of the Dead. And Day of the Dead in Mexico is a ceremony where it recognizes that your ancestors are come back to life, come back, and you sort of spend time reminiscing with them. In many cases, you go to the graveyard and have a picnic at their grave and talk about them and put out the food and liquor and so forth that they used to like. So it's very fitting that they took this ceremony that's a very big thing, cultural thing in Mexico, and timed that so that they're bringing Zoogneticus tequila back to life in its original habitat. And so the good news is that this introduction has been very successful. We were there just a couple weeks ago, and you can actually snorkel or scuba dive in this semi-natural pond, which is about maybe neck deep. And there's still non-native species in there, but they've been knocked down quite a bit. There's a mecca in there. And if you go down on the bottom, the Zoogneticus or tequila are quite shy, but you look at some of the rocks and the undercuts, and the population seems to be thriving. They've been in there a couple of years, they're reproducing, the population seems good. So it's a very hopeful sign. There's been a lot of work done on the Morelia University end to try to get these fish introduced, do the background work, and going forward, and so the idea is that if it worked for Zoogneticus tequila, let's try Scyphia francaise. That's the other extinct one. Once again, there were no Scyphia francaise left in Mexico. So as we came down to this, we had a workshop in Guadalajara a couple of weeks ago. We actually brought some of our aquarium specimens from the US, we brought some from Europe, and basically repatriated them to Mexico. So again, this is not just, when you're keeping these fish, it's not just a feel-good kind of exercise. There's a chance in the future that some of these fish could contribute to a reintroduction. And so the Scyphia francaise that I'm keeping, some of the people in Europe, are going to be the ancestors of the fish that they ultimately stock out there. And they'll do the same sort of process. They'll put them in a pond and raise them up so they have a critical mass, put them in an area where there aren't too many non-native species. The issue with any of these reintroductions, because these non-natives are here for good, you can't eliminate them, is that you constantly have to be on guard, you constantly have to be reducing them, removing them, keeping their populations low. And so in the short term, the university can do this as part of their study, as part of their project. But this is essentially an indefinite thing going decades into the future you have to keep doing this. And it's really impractical to think that a university is going to be able to keep this up for a long time. So what a lot of their other effort has been allowing and giving the local community the knowledge and the incentive to actually do the maintenance and management of these species on their own. And it's been really impressive. They've been working with the schools, they've been working with the local municipal government. They have all these posters, all these videos, they have all these workshops, basically creating a sense of pride in Teuchitlan that, hey, this little town here in Mexico, you have 2 species that are found nowhere else in the world. To one of those unfortunate catastrophes, a toxic spill, a disease epidemic, some new invasive species that gets in there that they can't really control. And more generally, because water is so scarce in Mexico, there's constant overuse of water and pumping and things. And many other parts of Mexico, springs have completely dried up from excessive use. And so, although there's a lot of effort to keep Teuchitlan healthy, to keep the population there healthy, there's things, you know, bad luck kind of things, or bad planning kind of things that could eliminate it. And again, we're going to rely on local support for many, many years. It's not going to be next year or 5 years from now, it's going to be 50 years from now. You know, kids of the kids today, their grandkids are going to have to adopt this fish and keep working at eliminating the non-native species because they're here to stay. So, you know, that's a question. In 50 years from now, they're going to have the same enthusiasm and excitement that they have now. I don't know. And finally, it's been critical that for the existence of these species, that hobbyists have kept them alive. Hobbyists have maintained them over the years. But we know from experience that species come in and out of favor, and species that were extremely common and everybody had them and you could get them at an auction for 50 cents, 5 years ago, now no one can find. People have decided, well, everybody has this, I'm going to get something else. And things really quickly can fall out of favor and disappear. And so there are Goodeid species that were 15, 20 years ago were everywhere and really easy to find, and now no one seems to have them. And that's a chronic problem. So again, in the Goodeid Working Group in the ALA, we're trying to get people to really adopt these fish for the long term, not just to get bat points or not just to, until you get bored with them, but make a commitment, as long as I'm keeping fish in my fish room, I'm going to set aside 1 or 2 tanks for this particular population and not, clean it out when some cooler fish comes along. But that is always a risk as well, because no matter what happens at Teuchitlan, the Aquarius are the backup. They're the plan B, and that needs to continue. They're not by any means out of the woods at Teuchitlan yet with any of these species, and things could change tomorrow. So we have to continue maintaining these fish, and of course supporting the reintroduction and conservation on the ground here, but there's nothing guaranteed about that. And so the Aqualab in Morelia, which is maintaining lots of fish, they have to keep going. We have to keep going as hobbyists. We have to keep the local people engaged and the local people valuing this research, which again has no direct commercial value to anybody. No one's going to get rich because of Ameca splendens. But again, it's more of a pride thing and an identity thing for the town of Teuchitlan. So, again, my pitch here is that you all can help. Maintain rare Goodeids. These 3 species, there's 40 species of Goodeids, overall about 40, 42, depending on how you count. And all of them need help. All of them need people keeping them. And there's these different conservation groups. Certainly the Chicago Livebearer Society here is a key local one that you're all part of. I urge you also to become members of the American Livebearers Association if you're not already, in the Goodeids Working Group as well. And these are good ways to get fish, get information about fish, meet people with similar interests, and you can learn from and exchange ideas and just get inspiration from. So I make these talks mainly to get people excited about Goodeids and get people excited about keeping Goodeids. And we have some really interesting ones here in the auction, and hopefully you'll grab them, and hopefully you'll like them and you'll want to keep them for more than just breeding them for 6 months and then moving on to something else. So with that, I'm open for questions.